Hello there, this is All 24 News special coverage on the Russia-Ukraine file with me, Karim Fazakri, coming to you live from Algiers. Russia's invasion of Ukraine and the subsequent sanctions on its economy have worsened the inflated global food prices, primarily affecting those in poorer countries. The subsequent economic sanctions have targeted large parts of Russian economy, Russian oligarchs, and members of the Russian government. As a result of its war, estimates of a 30-year economic setback are projected for Russia. But the economic sanctions also seem to have backfired on the Western countries, proving that sanctions have little effect, and soaring prices around the globe have become a subject of complaint for many. To talk more about these developments, I am joined live via Skype by Mr. Firas Mudad, a geopolitical and risk analyst from England. And also from Sweden, I am joined live by Professor Greg Simons, a professor and geopolitical analyst. Thank you, gentlemen, for joining us. A short break, and we kick off the discussion. And before we commence, I guess it's okay if I share with you, dear guests and dear viewers, what's on tap today. The leaders of France, Germany and Italy headed to Kyiv in an apparent show of collective European support and solidarity for Ukraine as it tries to resist Russia's military operation. Let's watch this report, then we get down to discussion.
The leaders of France, Germany and Italy visited Kyiv on Thursday as a show of European support for Ukraine, as Russia presses what they called its brutal offensive in the east of the country. Ukraine's Minister of Regional Development on Thursday gave the leaders a tour in Irpin.
Innocent civilians have been affected, houses have been destroyed, an entire city has been destroyed. Even thought there was no military infrastructure. That says a lot about brutality of the Russian war of aggression, which is bent on destruction. We have to keep that in mind in all that we decide.
French President Emmanuel Macron, German Chancellor Olaf Scholz and Italian Prime Minister Mario Draghi arrived in the Ukrainian capital by train from Poland as form of further solidarity with the Ukrainian people and government. Leaders also assured that the visit also includes financial and humanitarian help, as the EU will continue to provide weaponry for the war-torn country. Germany's Chancellor also expressed his support for Ukraine and Moldova's ambition to join the European Union after talks with President Volodymyr Zelensky.
In recent days, the Ukrainian army recognizes this, with the French scissors in particular, which are very useful. Then, through financial support, we began as Europeans to provide funding to rebuild these sites. that were affected, devastated for some, as you have seen, and we began to cooperate to provide support.
It's a question of credibility that we make good on promises to the states of the Western Balkans. Now, and concretely, there are clear criteria for accession to the EU that must be by all candidates. The rule agreed on the EU apply, especially with regards to democracy and rule of law.
For his part, Ukrainian president told European leaders that only a unified effort could force Russia to stop the war after Macron's suggestion to visit Moscow for mediating with the Russian President Vladimir Putin.
I'm not sure that today certain leaders in the world can force Russia to stop the war alone. Only collectively and only together, only united, will it be a powerful force that will stop the Russian Federation.
It is the first time that the leaders of the three European Union countries have visited Kyiv since Russia's February 24th military operation started, at a time when Kyiv is pushing to be given official candidate status to join the EU.
And speaking of the candidate status to join the EU, let me start with you, Mr. Firas Mudad. The question of whether or not Ukraine should join the EU and how Russia would react has been a contentious issue for years. While most European nations are firmly behind Ukraine and have, to varying degrees, of course, aided Zelensky in his war efforts, it's far from certain that his wish will be granted. For political and procedural reasons, it is possible that the EU ultimately decides that now is not the right time. And even if they did agree with European Commission President Ursula von der Leyen's opinion that Ukraine should be considered for membership, it could take years, even decades, for it to become a reality. Can you tell us how ineffective and much of a burden that could weigh heavily on the EU bloc? And can you give us a sense of where assistance stands to the Ukrainian and the sanctions part of it?
First of all, thank you for hosting me. Secondly, I think that the Ukrainians absolutely will not be joining the European Union. I think that this is just some noise made to entertain the media and to hide the fact that the Europeans are unable to do anything meaningful to help Ukraine, in part because of their energy dependence on Russia, in part because over the years under NATO, the Europeans have had no meaningful military capability that can deter the Russians, and in part because nobody wants an actual conflict with the Russians. They're content to have this be a proxy conflict. It's worth remembering when you think about the sanctions, a couple of details. Firstly, the damage of the sanctions has mostly been borne by Western consumers who have seen their energy bills inflate very quickly. And with that, inflation across the board, because as you know, energy inflation ends up affecting everything. Mm-hmm. Secondly, it's worth recalling that autocratic governments tend to like sanctions for several reasons. The first reason they like sanctions is that it forces them to concentrate more on domestic production and therefore enables them to be more autonomous and less dependent on external powers. The second reason is that it forces the rich classes in the targeted sanctioned country to plow their money back into the economy, especially when you see what has been done in targeting of Russian billionaires, who essentially have been forced to repatriate some of their wealth into Russia and invest it back into the country. And these were the people that would have traditionally been some of the West's closest allies because of their business interests in the West and because of their lifestyle choices. The third reason autocratic governments like sanctions is because sanctions end up crushing the middle class. And the most politically destabilizing force in most countries tends to be the middle class. Mm-hmm. So when the middle class is crushed, you end up with a two-class society, the haves and the have-nots. And this is a much easier society to control and to police. So I would say that the sanctions have been extremely poorly thought out, that they have damaged the West far more than they have destabilized President Putin. And I think that the major beneficiary from sanctions has in fact been the Russian Federation.
Mm-hmm. Clear indeed. Let's include Professor Greg Simons in the conversation. Can you tell us, Professor, according to you, how do EU countries feel about Ukraine joining the EU? I mean, having a country that's currently at war start the accession process raises all sorts of issues. There are a number of candidate states that have been in the accession process for years and have in some cases had their accession slowed down because of domestic political instability. One example of this is the case of Turkey, for instance, whose application has been essentially frozen following fears over a backslide over the rule of law and human rights. Starting the process with the country currently at war will raise undoubtedly questions from other candidate states who have had their applications similarly frozen. There are also real concerns that Ukraine is a long way from meeting the Copenhagen criteria anytime soon. What's your take on this?
Well, I agree fully and wholeheartedly with your previous speaker. It raises a number of very pertinent points. I would say, yes, I mean, this has been very selective attention because we're talking about these, I would say it's a self kind of delusion about the West's power and influence. Obviously, it is not. I mean, you're getting these signals that, that Ukraine might, and I agree that this is not something that is realistic from a number of perspectives, might get a chance to apply for membership to the EU. Of course, this is just stringing Ukraine along, but at the same time, while you've got the EU saying this and you've got these particular 3 EU member states there in Kiev, don't forget, I mean, you've got Stoltenberg and US officials saying, well, Ukraine might need to give up territory in order to make peace with Russia. So you're getting these very split signals, of course. And, I mean, there are going to be much more pain for Europe or for the US, as has been noted, than for Russia. Russia has been preparing for these sanctions at least since 2014. And it has been sourcing its needs from elsewhere, as well as making this domestic production, which has been noted. They're much more sanctions-proof than the West is from its own sanctions. And of course, the problem is, for the West, is to openly admit that their sanctions are a failure. And what they're talking about is nothing more than some kind of symbolic political banter, I would say, rather than anything realistic. And so how do you go back from there when you've said your ace card all along has been sanctions to deter Russia, firstly, and then to get Russia to stop? And I'd say the follow-up point on that is they're talking about the world is against it. The world is not against it. Those Western-centric parts of the world, which are under the US unipolar hegemony, are against it. So this is NATO, EU, Taiwan, South Korea, Japan, Australia, New Zealand. The rest of the world is either indifferent or has no strong opinion about what Russia is doing to Ukraine. So it's different worlds, and with the Western-centric world in decline, there seems to be a lot of, what would we say, self-delusion about their power and place in the world.
Thank you indeed. Let me share with you what's developing on the ground. At least 4 people were killed and 7 injured as Russia fighter jets attacked the city of LYSYCHANSK in eastern Ukraine on Thursday. Rockets hit the cultural center in the city where more than 40 had sought shelter, according to officials. The battle for control of LYSYCHANSK and neighboring Severodonetsk has become the focus of Russia's offensive in recent weeks. The cities lie in Ukraine's eastern Donbas area, the country's industrial heartland, full of factories and coal mines.
In the Severodonetsk direction, Russian occupiers continue firing against the units of our troops from all Weber fire weapons in the areas of the settlements Belorivka, LYSYCHANSK and Severodonetsk. The enemy does not attempt to establish full control over the city of Severodonetsk. It continues the assault, the fighting continues.
Back to you, Mr. Firas Modad. What's your reading about where Putin's political and military objectives are right now and how they evolved over the last 100 days or so?
So I would say, firstly, that it is not about President Putin personally. This is a tactic that is used by the West to try to say that there is this crazy man in charge rather than respect the interests of the Russian nation or of the Chinese nation or of any nation that is not fully on board with the West. That's the first point that I would make. The second point that I would make is that I think that the Russian position in general has been gradually and increasingly hardening because of what they see as very extreme statements coming out of Western capitals saying that we must defeat Russia and Russia must be seen to be defeated, saying that Crimea will be taken back, not just the territory that has been occupied in the more recent offensive, saying that Russia must be completely cut off from the world and completely insulated. These kinds of very extreme positions convince the Russians that this is a fight that they must win. And it's not just Putin that's increasingly convinced of that, I would argue. When you see sanctions applied against the patriarch of the Orthodox Church, Patriarch Kirill, this is a very extreme movement. What you're saying to the Russians is that this is a war against your identity and your religion, which is frankly intolerable for any average Russian person. So I think that the Russian position has increasingly been hardening. I think that if you look at the ground militarily, the stories about a successful Ukrainian counteroffensive in Kharkov and in the Nikolaev direction in Kherson were completely, very heavily exaggerated. I think the Russians are showing that after the initial setbacks that they had in terms of trying to resolve this war quite quickly, they are now comfortable with a slow grinding war that gradually destroys the Ukrainian military. I think when the Ukrainians come out and say that they need 1,000 artillery pieces and 500 tanks and several hundred APCs, they're saying that they don't have an army anymore and that they need a new army. Mm-hmm. And they're saying that they can only mount a defense using infantry in the cities, essentially using civilian infrastructure, if not civilians themselves, as cover. Mm-hmm. So this is something that's going to be noted by the Russians, and this is something that is going to harden their positions.
Mm-hmm. And but it seems that Ukrainians have fought well, Professor Mudad. They have fought well and targeted forward deployed Russian forces in the Kyiv area, that is, and the Russians seem to have pulled back. They have also prevented the Russians from taking Kharkiv as well. What is your sense out of that?
They have fought very bravely. Mm-hmm. Nothing said here is intended to disparage the courage of Ukrainian combatants. Nothing of the sort. Mm-hmm. But there is an element of realism here that's missing. Part of that realism is that the stories about these counteroffensives proved to be false. The Russians moved their forces around. They shuffled their forces to concentrate them more effectively when initially they had dispersed them very much, in part with a view towards pinning down Ukrainian forces, in part because they were being overly ambitious. Now this phase is over, and they've moved to a phase of slowly grinding down the very courageous Ukrainian soldiers who are still, at the end of the day, being ground down. Mm-hmm. And when Ukrainian officials say that they need all of this level of equipment, it means that the equipment that they did have has been destroyed and has been found to be insufficient. So militarily, this is going to tell the Russians that they've paid a very heavy price. It's going to tell them that if they allow the Ukrainians to come out in any decent shape out of this war, the threat from Ukraine will not abate. It will only be renewed. And this is going to push Russians towards more maximalist positions. This is what I'm saying. And I'm not in any way disparaging the courage of Ukrainian soldiers at all. Mm-hmm. The other
and
point
you think
that,
perhaps the heavy artillery that's going to be sent by the Western countries is not going to be any helpful?
It's not going to come in enough numbers. It's not going to be in time. Mm-hmm. It's not going, there isn't going to be enough time for the Ukrainians to train on it. Mm-hmm. And given the fact that the air dominance is fully in favor of the Russians, the problem of new artillery is something that the Russians will be able to deal with. Mm-hmm. It will slow them down, perhaps, but it will not stop them.
Mm-hmm. So according to your own analysis, it seems that Russia is going to rise victorious from this war. Let me here include Professor Greg Simons. Can you tell us, Professor, how challenging will it be to retake territory from dug-in Russian forces and who have lots of artillery, that is? Can you tell us how difficult or challenging this might be for Ukraine to get back its territories lost to the Russians?
It's not. Simply, I mean, for the reasons given by the previous speaker, they don't have the manpower. I mean, even the top Ukrainian politicians are now, I mean, like the head negotiator, he's admitting they're losing 300 to 500 soldiers a day. That's unsustainable for any military, especially one like Ukraine. I mean, they can't deal with that. I mean, the point is they're going to run out of soldiers long before they run out of material. And, I mean, this material, I mean, it's not going to play too much in the game because, for the reasons said. I mean, Russia has air superiority. It also is targeting these weapon shipments when they come into the country. As soon as they're stored, those stores are targeted. They're taken out. So, I mean, you're getting a fraction get to the front line. You're having Ukrainian military units that are actually refusing to fight. And more and more this is happening. You're having whole units, battalion-sized units that say, we're not getting enough support in terms of weapons, supplies, bad leadership, and they say they're getting used as cannon fodder. And now you're getting very problematic statements like Zelensky. He says, we will fight down to the very last Ukrainian soldier, and then starts to speak about conscripting women. These are not statements you get from someone who's winning a war. These are desperate statements you're getting from someone who's trying to cling on to continuing to fight the war.
So despite the sanctions and despite the Western Union in face of the Russian war against Ukraine, it seems that Russia is going to rise victorious from this. Is that what you're saying?
I am saying that, and I'm not alone in saying that. There's more and more. I mean, Stoltenberg, he just said the other day, the head of NATO, that Ukraine is going to need to make peace, and if it makes peace, it might need to part with some of its territory to make that peace. This is coming from the head of NATO. And
are we going to see Ukraine perhaps accepting losing more territory to make this peace?
Well, it's not a matter of whether they're accepting or not. Ukraine, currently, they are not a subject in this war. They're an object in this war. And this is the main problem for Ukraine and its political leadership. They are not in control of events. The West is trying to push them to continue to fight Russia down to the last Ukrainian.
But what's it for them if they keep grinding this war? I mean, if they continue a fight that they know they are going to lose, what's it for the West? I mean, is Ukraine a victim of its own government, of the West?
Well, it's appearing to look that way because, if we look at these statements, even early on, Victoria Nuland, who is notorious, said we want to inflict a geopolitical defeat of Russia in Ukraine. So this has not been about Ukrainian sovereignty from the start. And we've had those statements from Austin and other top US generals and those others who are saying that they're openly admitting this is a proxy war against Russia, and they're using Ukraine for this. So, Ukraine is in the worst situation. And if we factor into it, that's the foreign aspects. If you look at the domestic aspects, of course, you've got those rather radicalized forces within the Ukrainian military and political structures that if Zelensky does try to make peace with Russia, he might be deposed not only from externally but internally.
And Mr. Firas Mudad here, if we are going to see some kind of concession from Ukraine in order to make this peace deal, what's it to the Russian, or let's say, what's it to the Western nation? How would we actually interpret this defeat of the West if actually they agree to sit on a negotiating table and Russia take these territories?
I think that assuming that the Russians would want a peace agreement now is not very realistic. There are good reasons why the Russians would not necessarily want one and would only accept one if Ukraine was to capitulate. And by that I mean accept Russian occupation and Russian control, including over the west of Ukraine. If that were to happen, you have to remember that right now the global system is built on confidence in the military power of the West and confidence in the economic power of the West. Well, if the West throws everything that it has into this conflict, in terms of sanctions and in terms of weapons supplies, falling short only of actually engaging directly against Russia, then that means that the West has been shown to be a paper tiger. And when confidence is lost in this manner, it has implications on political stability. It can be extremely politically destabilizing. You will see that in election outcomes. You might also see that on the street because you've put the Western consumers through this massive amount of inflation. You've made them suffer economic hardships that they haven't suffered in a very long time. You did nothing to protect them after the 2008 financial crisis. You rewarded the banks completely. And you did nothing to protect the average person. And now you've made them pay for this geopolitical folly. And you're saying to them, what exactly? What's the prospect here? Calm down, stay at home, vote again for Emmanuel Macron and Joe Biden? What are you offering the Western citizen here? And I don't think that the establishment is in a position to offer very much to the average Westerner. And I think more and more people are starting to realize that. This is why in France, for example, the majority of voters voted for anybody who isn't Macron in the first round. Then when they were given the choice between Le Pen and Macron, they chose Macron again half-heartedly. This is why you see this massive drop in popularity for President Biden. This is why you see that the new German government is very unpopular and very divided.
Absolutely.
It's going to trigger the defeat of the West in Ukraine is going to trigger a major political crisis in the West.
Speaking of crisis,
the
let me
Ukraine will
include
demonstrate.
Professor Greg Simon's concern in economic crisis and energy crisis. A further decline in Russian gas flows to Europe via the Nord Stream 1 pipeline, coinciding with an early heat wave gripping its south, deepened concerns the continent may struggle to build up storage ahead of the winter season as planned. An analyst warned that while immediate needs could be met, filling storage ahead of peak winter demand would be much more difficult if Russian supplies continued to fall. How could Germany wean itself off Russian gas here?
Not realistically anytime soon. They're committed to it. What are they going to do? Get some supplies of American LNG at 4 times the cost, uncertain delivery. They can't get this. And I mean, the problem with Europe and the West in general, they believe that this is like 20, 30 years ago when the West had won the Cold War and they were economically, militarily and politically the only kind of power on the planet, because the rest was either joining them or in disarray. And now, I mean, even if we look at just at the energy supplies alone, Europe is no longer the premium market. Asia is the premium market, but the West, for some reason, cannot come to terms with this. I mean, if we look historically, empires die, but they kind of stagger on for some time. If we look at 1914 was the end of the British Empire, but it was the Second World War that finished it off. So one can say, well, you had the global war on terrorism, which weakened the West by its own choice, and now these geopolitical ventures, because while we're looking at only Ukraine at this stage, the West is trying to play a similar game with China and Taiwan. So you're trying to play these two stupid games at the same time, and this might be the thing that finally finishes the West off in terms of its hegemonic status.
Mr. Firas Mudad, Russia's Gazprom is making huge profits despite sharply lower exports to Europe, thanks to soaring natural gas prices, that is. However, EU's reliance on Russian gas and a risk that Moscow could cut it off in retaliation to economic sanctions imposed after its invasion of Ukraine has been a major headache for the bloc, prompting it to build up inventories and seek alternative supplies. Can you tell us, is the EU able of coping without Russian oil and gas?
I don't think that's realistic at all. If you look at the alternatives, you're looking at some alternatives from Israel, which requires some time to develop. You're looking at Egypt, which can provide some LNG. You're looking at Algeria. You're looking at Libya. Obviously, Libya now with the production shutdown. Algeria is not going to side with the West against Russia because of the historic military and political partnership between the two countries. There are no realistic alternatives. U.S. LNG, as Professor Greg said, is coming at multiple times the cost. It's not a realistic alternative. The German industry is saying that we can't afford this. The levels of inflation that Europe is experiencing are an indication that the average European citizen cannot tolerate this. The dream of green energy is, frankly, a laughable one because A, solar and wind are not reliable. B, the majority of production of solar and wind comes from China. So instead of depending on Russia, you end up dependent on China. Now, that's not a brilliant geopolitical move by any measure. And finally, Russia will always find a market for its energy It's offering it to India at a massive discount because India does not want Russia and China to get too close, given its problems with China and its historically good relations with Russia. So the West has put itself in a bind. And over time, various countries in Latin America and in Africa and in Asia will say to the Europeans and to the Americans, or to a fraction of the Europeans and to the Americans, look, you don't get to regulate us. We are sovereign states. We do not get regulated out of Brussels, which itself gets regulated out of Washington, D.C. We will make our own decisions. If we want to trade with the Russians, we will figure out a way to trade with the Russians. And that will be in their best interest because they need the food products, the commodities, and the energy products that the Russians can offer them. So the West has dug itself into a hole. It escalated very heavily. President Biden was bragging about how the ruble was hitting 130 and the ruble was going to collapse. Well, now the ruble is in the 50-60 territory. So it's regained strength more than it had before the invasion.
Thank you so
and
much,
it's the
Mr.
West that's facing a massive inflation crisis.
Thank you so much for these thorough analysis along with Professor Greg Simons. Thank you, dear viewers, for keeping it here on All 24 News. We have reached the end of our special coverage for today. Bye for now.